Hey, everybody. Welcome to another Future of Church, where we are exploring the landscape of faith, technology, and culture. I'm chuckling a little bit because whenever we roll that intro, the best part about the studio is that we can down in the bottom corner see each other, but you can't see anybody on screen. And I can't help but dance, but it's always funny watching guests because you were rocking to it a little bit. So anyway, for those of you who are just joining today, if the title has captured your attention, I hope it has. But before I get into it, I am Christopher and
I'm Joe.
hey, there you go. And we're going to be navigating this one. We're going to be talking about really the idolatry of technology. And we're not going, just so you know what to kind of expect with this. The goal of this episode is not to necessarily get into all the specifics of the technology and where it's going. There's a lot that we could talk about there, which we will. We have that planned, but this one is really just helping define what we mean when we talk about idolatry so that we have a better way to discern and decide how we evaluate our lives for the proper use of technology, because it is very much, I believe, high risk for becoming an idol in our life, and not just in the generic sense of, oh, that's an idol in my life type of a thing. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think so. And just to jump straight into it, keying off of what you just said there at the end about, oh, it's just this thing in my life. I would guess that the majority of people who come across this podcast, if they're, anywhere near our demographic, is most of our Christian education, when we talk about idolatry, we don't think about, the things carved of wood and stone and shaped from metal, because we don't feel like they're regular occurrences in our lives. And so
Right.
we've again, speaking of my experience and what I've witnessed for others, even, it becomes a lot more abstract as a result, where we think, okay, well, anything that takes the place of God is an idol. Okay, that's an okay definition, but how do we apply it? And the applications that I see most really have a lot more to do with like prioritization of our time. Just to say, well, I don't
We
have
see
any
that a lot.
time. Yeah, I don't have any time to read my Bible. Well, how much time are you spending on your
What
Xbox
idols do you
or your
have in your life
computer?
that you need
Right.
to,
Hey,
remove?
yeah. Maybe those are examples of idols, and you need to get those out of your life. And
It's almost like self-help. I
right.
mean, in many ways, and I think a lot of the conversations around a lot of the Christian conversations you'll hear, it can be like a self-help. Oh, you don't have time to do that?
Oh, yeah.
Reprioritize your life like this.
Right.
But we'll Christianize it by saying, remove the idols from your life, and then there's your 6 principles or whatever.
Right. And it's an easy avenue for guilt to kind of really take root in your heart, where it maybe not always, necessary, because we were talking backstage about, like, yeah, I work 8 hours a day. That's that should be an act of worship. We're told to do everything in that way, as if, working for the Lord. But it's also time I'm not spending reading my Bible. It's not time I'm spending praying. And if something that takes an hour out of my life every evening is something that I can raise up as, oh, well, maybe this is an idol, because I could be using that time, studying God's word or whatever. Like, what do I think about my workday? What do I think about, the time I spend, relaxing and playing and all of that stuff?
Yeah.
It can be
it's very much what you're talking about. It can creep into this realm of legalism, where you start to go, this is how we should be doing things, or this is what I would expect if I were to observe someone, what I would see them spending their time doing. And anything that goes against whatever that legalistic definition is, then we're going to throw the word idolatry on it as a way to kind of, weigh the scales.
Yeah. Or, we have our senior pastor at our church is, has a huge eye out for, moralism too. Maybe it's not a legal thing, but hey, if you live your life like this, that
Yep.
will fit the guardrails of scripture. And so, we also have the danger then of saying, well, this highly productive person in a Christian sense or whatever, how do they spend their time? Okay, if I do this exact same thing in my life, I too can honor God. And so we also have the danger or opportunity to create pigeonholes that everyone has to fit inside, to
Yeah.
be whole and to really be living a life of worship. And we don't want to stray in those directions uh,
No.
at
So
all.
I am curious on this though. Your thoughts on this, because I just finished Jeremiah and Ezekiel, which you want to talk about books that talk a lot about idolatry.
Yeah.
There's some books you could read that really talk about this. But to your point, in a modern context, it can feel very disconnected when you read
Mhm.
some of these things, when you're like, okay, it feels very back then they used to do this. And now
Mhm.
in the modern world, we don't really participate in that kind of stuff anymore. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, how are you looking at it? Or when you think about this, like, what does that look like as you define it?
Just, I mean, really, we're talking about worship is the way that I would think about it.
Okay.
And, what are we
I'm curious to hear you talk
glorifying?
about that, because I think that can bring to light for people this idea of like, oh, I don't bow down to my phone type
Right.
of a thing. But that I know you, and from backstage, that's not what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's like, when we think about an idol, if we take away all of the practices, the specific things that we see in the Old Testament, whether, and in just history in general, with human sacrifice and, like temple prostitution and all, everything that, meat that's sacrificed to idols is referenced in the New Testament. If you take away all of those very specific things, no, in every case, when we're talking about worship, it's about trying to build a relationship with what we see as a deity with an expectation of, hope or blessing or, fill in the blank. And so if, to go back to kind of the money slash career angle, I mean, maybe it becomes a source of, maybe we can say that, hey, this is an item of worship. If we're saying, okay, I'm doing these things, I'm making these sacrifices so I can have this thing, because my hope is in that thing. That is the
Yeah.
thing that is going to bring me fulfillment and hope and security and all of those things, versus doing those things well, because that's a good representation of God and his desire for our lives to represent him well, but knowing that our hope and our security and all of those things are in him.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
whatever practices get wrapped up in that, I mean, it isn't inconsequential, but it's, you know, but they're not, those aren't the thing. It's, what am I doing? What am I trying to exchange for? What am I getting in return as an expectation from this relationship?
what's complicated about it, and I just was listening to what was it? Oh, the Bible Project podcast, and was just listening to where they're going through the Sermon on the Mount. And the one that just stands in mind that I think gets at some of what you're getting at is, when Jesus says, you have heard it said, and then he goes back and is like, but I say to you, and he's not
Mm-hmm.
contradicting himself, but is the one specifically they drilled in on was, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder. But I say, even if you say Raka, you will face, basically the Sanhedrin. If you even say you fool, like he almost
Mm-hmm.
reverses it and goes, you think murder's the worst? I'm actually going to tell you, saying you fool actually will put you in Gehenna, type of a thing, where you're going, this is really more about the heart
Yeah.
than the action itself. And going back to,
Right.
I think, about what you just described of this thing where we have this tendency to go, well, this many hours on my phone is not idolatry, but more than that, we're trying to put it in a box instead of going, like you said, where is your heart
Yeah.
with this kind of stuff? And when I think about technology and its pervasiveness, and it's everywhere, it almost can be difficult to start to discern, like, hey, when am I crossing a line where I'm no longer just doing this as a tool
Yeah.
to accomplish something? It's actually satisfying a need or desire, or I'm going to it in a way that is no longer healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another one, and there's kind of a tangent in my brain that gets me all the way here thinking about social media and thinking about now how, you know, what are the careers that, high school and junior high students, dream of having. And at one point it was an airline pilot because that was very glamorous.
Yep.
Doctors and lawyers, it's prominent, you make a lot of money. And now I think this is pretty well known. I've seen it published in a number of places.
Influencer,
It's being a
being an
social media
influencer.
influencer.
Yeah.
Like, and it's, it's a trend that follows the trends. Where are people making money? Where are my, can I get the most security for the least amount of effort in a lot of cases? And as rewards diminish for the things that take more work to do and get qualified for, you see that balance go. But intertwined in this, is the potential for idolatry, either of the money or idolatry even of the self. If you're thinking that by doing something like this I can glorify me and I can be the source of my own security and my own hope and all of that. And I know we're not getting into all the specifics of the what, but I know part of the reason we got into this conversation in the first place is the idea that in that idolization of the self, or the thing that allows you to emphasize the self and get your hope, security, whatever, is more and more found in technological avenues.
Yes, for sure. I mean, it is
And
absolutely feeding the self
yeah.
as, in many ways, a deity.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and so one of the things you had mentioned was just kind of in terms of this kind of table setting activity that we're going through this week, was just really establishing that, I mean, there is a spectrum on which we think of idolatry.
Yeah.
From what could be very trivialized in the manner of, well, anything could be an idol, really. So what are we even talking about? All the way over to the, well, this very specific thing is the example of idolatry we see in the Bible, and we're not seeing
Right.
that.
We see temple sacrifice and we see
So
temple prostitution, and I'm
right,
not doing that. So
right.
I'm sure I'm
So
fine.
so that's probably what idolatry is. But I think we also forget. I have a friend who went into a a temple that had idols, and people were coming in to worship, and they were there on a just kind of a cultural visit, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And they themselves are a Christian, and like they had a reaction in their spirit, like
Oh,
this is dark. Like people are coming in and going to these idols, these representations of gods, and they are exchanging worship for blessings. And so I think we also have a tendency to say, oh, idolatry is in our past because we don't see it.
but it's in our present, right?
Yeah, it's in our present. It's very much there. And I know you have, and I'm not asking you to, take a sharp turn into your testimony, but
No.
sophomore year of college, when we started as roommates, some of the conversations we had there, I was like, oh man, like spiritual darkness and spiritual warfare was kind of a thing in my head, but it didn't ever feel real because like I didn't have any experience with it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, we forget that, like, occult practices, these things
yeah,
that we read about in the Bible, they're not this thing of the ancient past
right.
that don't exist anymore. So even some of that stuff we see in the Old Testament and New Testament is still very much alive. But I think, to your point, one of the things that actually concerns me the most as I look at where we are from a technology standpoint is the fact that, so this person you described, and I think most people, many people, would have that kind of almost visceral
Mm-hmm.
reaction to what they've crafted in their head is what idolatry is. I mean, you just even see examples of like, you'll see like a viral video where somebody found like an animal sacrifice in the woods or something, and everybody kind of like freaks out. It's like, oh, that's so terrible. But I think about what technology is doing, and it's like that, turning the boiling water up on a frog, where it's like, okay, you're waking up in the morning and the first thing you're doing is looking at your phone and again, it's not what I don't like is when people get into the practice of like, so don't do this, get off this platform, blah, 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 blah. Instead of going, I mean, if the first thing you're doing is going to look, are you doing it because it's validating you? You're looking to see like, hey, how many likes did my post get? Or, how much positive perception am I getting over here? And it's one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, maybe you're not kneeling down in front of a molten image, but in some ways, some of these practices are becoming so ingrained in just our daily habits. I think they're basically the same thing. We just don't see it that way because it's more culturally appropriate and more socially acceptable.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of that. And, when I just to stay on the phone use thing, I mean, there's an element of escapism there.
Right.
And, and so that's where I end up with a lot of time there. It's just distracting and it pulls my attention. Sure. But, I think the first time we touched on AI, we talked about, a practice of discernment and how important that is currently and will continue to be in an even more heightened way of being able to look and say, okay, what am I actually doing with this? How is my heart responding to this? How am I processing what I'm seeing and what I'm doing and how I'm spending my time through, these different bits of technology, whether it's on the phone, on a VR set, on your computer, or wherever you're at. And, so you don't end up on a slippery slope. The other piece of it that I don't think we've talked about in here, but I know we've talked about at least privately, is the idea not just of the discernment for yourself, but the discernment, from and towards others, getting into that, Ephesians sense of co-submission to one another. Like, hey, I see something in how you're doing this. How are you processing that? How are you treating that time? Being an inquiring mind towards another person, and then even, having the availability first in your own heart to receive feedback and saying, hey, that doesn't sound like that's a good and healthy path to be on. And being able to receive that and process it and really think through it. And then also then have the relationships where you can say that back to somebody else as well and have it received thoughtfully and carefully on both ends up being a really, really critical practice when you're in a situation like you've already described where, well, what's the harm? So I get up and check my messages. Cool. All right. Well, maybe there is no harm there.
There might not be. And that's why I don't think the practice of like follow XYZ checklist and you'll be good. I don't think that's helpful for people at all.
Well, and it's also the reason why being inquisitive is so important too. And being able to understand that questions are not criticism.
Yeah.
Maybe they are, but don't assign that.
Funny is, it's funny you bring this up because one example, it was actually earlier today, I was in the kitchen talking to Ashley. And one of the things we were talking about was, I'm super active on LinkedIn. And one of the things that she shared was like, I like to post about when we have a new baby. It's like, it's an exciting thing for me. And I've taken some flack for it. She has in the past too, where people are like, well, why does, Christopher have to post about this type of a thing? And it was one of the things where she was honest about it. She said, at first, there was a part of me that was like, why does he? And she goes, but then I actually started observing you and seeing it was just genuine excitement from you. You just genuinely were excited that you had had a baby and you have all these people you know and are connected to who listen and follow you, and they get excited alongside you. And she's like,
Mhm.
and for me, all of a sudden, it was this recognition of your heart of, you're not doing this to be popular on social media. You're not doing this but we had a conversation about it. And I
Yeah.
remember when we did a while back, because it was, again, it was to your point, it was this, hey, I just want to check, where's this
Yeah.
coming from? Where's your heart in doing this? And for me, it was, I'm just so excited about it. Like, I just want to tell everybody that I made, why, type of a thing. And it was one of those like, oh, okay, because there may be something that for me in that instance, that may be totally fine. For someone else, that may actually not be a healthy practice,
Yeah.
because it turns into, well, I'm doing this because it validates me. It makes me feel good about myself. I'm trying to show other people how great. And again, I think that's where on that surface, one, to your point, we
Yeah.
have to be so careful how we assess other people and be
Mhm.
inquisitive and want to understand, rather than go, well, I saw you do this, and based on my XYZ checklist, I think that's not good. But
Yeah.
also be willing to hear that from people when they bring that up with us, and not get defensive, but more actually be willing to examine our own hearts and say, why am I doing the things I'm doing? And
Yeah.
what's actually at the heart of it?
Yeah. Yeah. I just even remember how one of the things that, I don't know that it delayed us starting this, but um, you and I had a series of conversations unrelated to this specific topic, but just you said something in a conversation with a group of guys, and I wasn't in a good place to receive it, and I reacted, um, and we got ourselves into a very reactionary conversation that wasn't productive, and I don't know how many weeks we were just exchanging Marco Polo's kind of long form stuff on perspectives and asking questions, um and all of that to sort it back out, when a couple of very short and easy and obvious questions on my part at the start would have gone, oh, you're talking about this, not that, and you're responding to this, not that, and you're expressing this other thing, not that. And then
Yeah.
everything would have been fine. I'm like, okay, cool. But we ended up digging ourselves into
But I
quite a
think
little
going back
trench.
to that experience, I think going back to that experience, and I think this is anybody who watches or listens to this,
Yeah.
I think there is so much opportunity for us to have more honest and open conversations
Yeah.
about this kind of stuff with each other. And again, assuming positive intent, approaching things with a genuine curiosity, but also being on the other side of that and really examining our hearts. Because honestly, technology becoming an idol in our life, I personally feel it is probably one of the greatest existential threats to society right
Hmm.
now. And it's only going to get worse. And like I said, we're not going to get into all the details of where things are going in this episode. But as I look at the forefront of where technology is today, how prevalent it is, as I look at like depression rates in adolescents and even adults in
Hmm.
response to social media, and I look at how deep its hooks are getting in, and then I look at where it's at and where it's going, and I'm like, holy cow, this thing is going to drag us into the muck. And it might not even have to drag us. We
Yeah.
might just be like, I'm on the path, I'm walking straight to it, because we don't realize how huge of a risk this is, because we kind of dismiss it as like,
Yeah.
oh well, we're not burning our children or anything like that, as according to this. And it's like,
Yeah. But we're still going to
oh,
have to ask the question, what are we willing to, whatever word you want to use, risk, give up, or even sacrifice, so that, so that we can have the bits of technology that we want, so that we can, um, you know, make worlds of our own devising and all of this stuff. Um, that's going to be a really key question that we'll need to ask. What are we exchanging, you know, in return for what and why?
Well, and it's interesting you bring that point up because, I've listened to a number of conversations and had conversations with people. And one of the things that I think and you hinted at it before, I won't go deep down the rabbit hole, but I think one of the things people forget is that people worshipped it was, you look at like the biblical text in this, I think we sometimes have forgotten that it's like there's something real happening there. This isn't just like, oh, these ancient morons who thought, they believe this mysticism stuff and we're so educated. The chronological snobbery that kicks in where you're like, oh, those people, now we really know how the world works. We wouldn't fall for such a thing. There is a spiritual side of this. And again, going back to what you had said, like my past, where you go, no, this is real. Like there really is, these people were doing things to get something back in return. This wasn't just some fake, oh, I just do it because it's the thing to do. There was a transaction that was occurring. And that's very much what we're seeing in technology, where it's like there is a transaction that is occurring between us and technology and going, I want this. I'm willing to what your point was, I'm willing to give up this in return to get this. And as technology continues to grow in what it has to offer, that's where that dangerous path of you can start to go, well, what do I need God for? Because it's a transactional relationship. I give you X, you give me Y. I'm happy. I get whatever it is I think I need. Why on earth would I need to go to God anymore? And it sounds far out there, but this goes back to like some of the stuff I've seen. I'm like, man, people have sacrificed far worse for far less than what you're going to be able to get from tech.
Well, and we already do it, don't we? Where
it's not like in the future.
if I pray to God because I want, we'll stick to, not even history, because I want my son to get better. I don't know how God's going to respond to that. He's the great physician. He can cure anything at a thought, just an act of his will. But he doesn't always do that.
He doesn't always tell us why he doesn't always do that.
And
we don't even get an answer sometimes.
That he's there with us through whatever it is. And it's like, okay, sometimes that feels like a great comfort. Sometimes it feels like a small comfort. But, what's the temptation level if I find out that, oh, if I do this X, Y, or Z, I can guarantee that my son feels better. And then, and if I do that and I get the result I want because it's guaranteed, at least so far as, I'm concerned, the technology is concerned, whatever, do I still choose to give glory to God for that restoration? Or do I start saying, you know what? I'm not getting quite what I want from God, and I just got what I wanted from that. What now? And then it's kind of touching on what we talked about last time, when that happens in relationships, for all the guys I know who pray earnestly for a wife, with, certain qualities and this and that. And it's like, oh, you're not getting it. You're not getting it. God's not delivering it. At least that's how we view it. But then we find out, oh, maybe there's another option here.
Yeah, maybe I don't have to go through this whole path that God's laid before me, the narrow path, right? I mean, I just think of the biblical analogies used, like, well, what if I don't have to take that narrow path? Because that narrow path, it's not really the path I would have painted.
Right.
And it's kind of narrow. I kind of like the fact that I have all these other options over here that, I mean, by all looks and feels, seem to get me to the same destination.
Yeah.
But hey, I can do it my way.
Right.
What's funny as you talk about this, that I think is an interesting dynamic as I think about human psychology in relationship to idolatry, which I think is actually one of the biggest threats of tech, is when you brought up earlier, like idolatry is when we worship something other than God. But what I think is interesting about that is I feel like when we're truly worshiping God, we're actually submitting and giving him the glory and actually submitting under him and going,
Right.
I want to submit to you. When I think about the dangerous idolatry, which is anything other than worshiping God, you actually are not putting yourself in submission. It's transactional in nature. It's like, I'm willing to do this in return to get that. And I think back to even some of the practices, and that's why I said, going back to it, they didn't do this because they were trying to actually submit to these false gods because they just wanted to be humble servants and just do this. Ultimately, it was one of these like, I want something, whether it's, sex or money or success or out of
Yeah.
fear. I'm afraid of the punishment I'm going to get, so I'll give you what you want type of, but it's very self-serving. I mean, ultimately you are the God in that transaction. You're just trying to do whatever it is that gets you what you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which technology is fantastic at doing. It
Yeah.
is phenomenal at giving you what you want. And if anything, the concerning part about it is it can give the impression of there's no consequences for this.
Right. Yeah. There's no consequences. And then, and I'm sure we'll get into this more next time, but if we're already concerned about the privilege divides that exist all around the world, that like you'll have a God that is more accessible to a certain class of people.
Right.
And what does that mean for people who don't have those same means to achieve or access or whatever? And what does that do for how we classify our needs? And what do we start demanding from whether it's government or other social services to fulfill those needs for a collective? I don't know if this is still true. I don't keep up on this, but I know I had read a couple years ago now just how our economy is getting less and less focused on possession so much as access. And hence like streaming services, I get access to what I need, and if I don't want access, I can just cut it off. I don't have any stake in it. People wanting to not own cars but rent as needed. I know there was a movement in that direction. I know some of that still exists in mostly larger city areas. I could, same thing for this stuff. It's like, okay, I can afford it for a week now and again versus full time, and the infrastructure that could come up around that. And, we already have big divides. You can see it on election maps between cities and, urban centers and rural areas. And, I just, all of these things, as you start putting in, talk about this technology and the expense, and is it more of an access economy or an ownership economy, and all of this stuff, just like the divides that we already have that already exist, just deepening and further calcifying. There's a lot of potential for that. And
Sure.
And it's again, what are we willing to sacrifice, give up, lay aside for this thing, for what we believe.
And on that piece, going back to it, and I think this again is one of the dangers of technology, is it's grossly misunderstood. And so people don't understand what goes into it. So even let's just take generative AI as an example. It's one of these things that to the average person just showed up on the map and suddenly gave them something, which seems great. But what people don't always understand is what went into getting it to that point and who was exploited and taken advantage of and all this other stuff. Like I know some case studies of this where some of the people who were used to train the large language models were exposed to horrific content because they had to train the model, and it had to be like, well, somebody's got to tell it what's okay and what's not okay. So we just have to expose. And it wasn't, I'll tell you right now, they were exploiting the vulnerable who just needed money to be like, hey, we got this job for you. All you got to do is you got to do this. And some of these people who are suffering now from PTSD and mental illness because of what they've been exposed to, that most of us have no idea that even happened. And I think about I think back to, anybody who looks into like, what goes into the sex industry and the exploitation of people that's underneath that many people just don't get. They're just like, well, there's just a product at the end. I don't really know what went into it. I kind of would rather not know, because then all of a sudden I actually see what's really under the hood, and I'd really rather not. And I think that again goes back to this point of, what are we really willing to give up to get what we want? And if we aren't informed on all this stuff, it is just even that much easier to get sucked into it.
Yeah.
So what else? Any other, like I said, we're running tight on time today because of what we've got going, but any other thoughts on this? I mean, I think, like I said, to me, this is probably one of the biggest crises facing this generation today, is where technology is already and where it's going, and what we've got to navigate ahead. But we're never going to navigate it well if we don't see the threat for what it is. And we're just like, oh, it's just a part of life. It's part of the air we breathe, type of a thing. If I just get my, screen time set right, and I make sure I don't spend too many hours on this and that, then I'm fine. And it's like, well, actually, no, you actually won't be.
Yeah. I don't think I have anything additional. I think we covered like most of the context setting, kind of the groundwork around that idea of idolatry and kind of how it fits into our overall conversation. So I'm happy with where we're at. I hope people who are listening are as well.
Well, you know what? And if they're not, we've got the Future of Church podcast at gmail.com. You can email us and you can give us your additional thoughts on this, because, I am interested to hear where people are. And I do think there's this overemphasis on solutioning instead of really understanding the problem and leaning into, well, what is God really doing in my heart and in my life to make sure that I don't fall vulnerable to this? Now, moving forward, we're actually going to get into some of these specific use cases that I think people do need to be aware of, especially as I start looking at what's happening in the transhumanism space, where these other things are going, where it's like, man, if you thought this was a risk today, you ain't seen nothing. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, with that, then we will leave it at this. If you are listening and you have found this podcast helpful, I would ask that you go give it a rating and a review. You don't have to give 5 stars, but of course we love the 5-star reviews, just to help people find this podcast. If you could also just share it with somebody who may benefit from it. We're continuing to grow this, and really our purpose and goal in this is just to help people better understand the world we're living in, and what does it mean to live in a modern technological society, but live it through a biblical worldview. Because while some people don't see it this way, the Bible has a lot to say about this, and that's what we're hoping to accomplish with this. So thanks again, Joe. I always enjoy our conversations. Hopefully others enjoyed it as much as I did. All right. Well, then we will see you on the other side.